He's an elder statesman, an international citizen. Would like to welcome His Excellency, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, SAN, GCON, a former Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, the Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, Senator Kashim Shettima, ably represented today by Princess Zainab Audu, the DG of PEBEC, Honorable Minister of Budget and National Planning, Senator Atiku Bagudu, beg your pardon. The representative of the Governor of Enugu State, Dr. Ngozi Eni, the First Lady of Katsina State, Her Excellency Hajia Zuliat Diko Rada, Her Excellency Erelu Bisi Fayemi, former First Lady of Ekiti State, Chichi Anyagolu, the Regional Director, Ford Foundation, Mr. Gbenga Oyebode, a member of the board of Ford Foundation, Your Excellencies, friends and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by thanking Ford Foundation West Africa for the very kind invitation to give these keynote remarks. And may I add my own congratulations also to the Foundation on its 65th anniversary here in West Africa, and commend the Foundation on 65 years of the Foundation's unwavering commitment to advancing social justice and strengthening democracy across our sub-region. Which leads me to the topic of my keynote remarks: social justice as an imperative to development. Social justice as an imperative to development. And if you look at the theme of this event, it is the journey to social justice. Africa is currently the fastest growing continent in GDP terms, and has been so for a while. Yet it remains the continent with the lowest overall quality of life, based on global indices, like measuring health, education, infrastructure, economic stability. In other words, GDP growth does not mean development for the majority. It does not necessarily translate to jobs or a decent life for citizens. One of my biggest frustrations as Vice President and Chair of the economic team of our government from 2016 to 2019 at the time was how people reacted when we talked about GDP growth figures. The vast majority simply, ask you, do these people live in a different country? I can't pay my children's school fees or hospital bills. Where is this growth? It became clear to me that when we as governments talk about growth, citizens wonder what we're talking about. Only big business, banks, corporates understand those things. For many, the promise of a better life that liberal democracy offers is simply not there. So what is the problem, and how can it be resolved? How can development and growth touch the lives of the majority of our people? It seems to me that there is only one way, and it is by making social justice the foundation of our economic thinking, of our planning, and of our development. In other words, we shouldn't talk about development unless it is somehow tied to the well-being and welfare of the majority of our people. So what is this social justice? And what has it got to do with development? I think it's really quite simple. Social justice is the principle that every person must have fair access to opportunities, to protection of rights and resources that are necessary to live a dignified and productive life. It places the human being, not statistics, at the center of development. So social justice ensures that the gains of economic growth are not captured by a few, but are converted into well-being, into stability and productivity for the many. It is the basis of what has been described by some as people-centered governance. That means measuring development by how many people actually experience improvements in their lives, access to jobs, education, proper access to healthcare, and safety. The more people who benefit, the greater national productivity. So a people-centered framework or a social justice framework insists that budgets, public investments, and reforms must be designed around the welfare of the majority of people from the start, not as an afterthought. So this requires a decisive shift from the trickle-down assumptions that we make in budgeting to bottom-up inclusive strategies. So when women, youth, rural populations, informal workers, and other marginalized groups gain education, when they gain legal recognition, when they have access to healthcare and social protection, they can contribute fully as workers, as innovators and entrepreneurs. This is what social justice achieves. It expands the productive base of the economy. In practical terms, when budgeting in a country where most citizens are poor, you start at the bottom of the pyramid, not at the top, where we just hope that benefits will trickle down. Fiscal policy must prioritize investments that improve the lives of the majority of people. Rural healthcare, public education, clean water, smallholder agriculture, and microcredit for the informal sector. So supporting small enterprises that employ the bulk of our people with microfinance, with skills training, and rural infrastructure are not social costs. They're actually high return investments in human capital. In many countries of the world, simply giving girls equal educational opportunities as boys can transform the development story. In the early 90s, some will recall that in rural Bangladesh, the girl child did not really have a future. Early marriage, unpaid work, and silence was a lot of the girl child. And many girls never stepped foot in a classroom. But a bold idea emerged. What if girls were given the same education as boys? The government, supported by NGOs like BRAC, BRAC, I'm sure some of us are familiar with that massive NGO in Bangladesh, launched a radical initiative to pay stipends to parents to send their girls to school. By the way, BRAC is a Ford grantee as well. Suddenly, millions of young women who had been written out of the economy were holding books, they were learning skills, and they were imagining futures. Fast forward 2 decades, those girls became the backbone of Bangladesh's economic rise. They filled the newly expanding garment factories, not as cheap labor, but as educated workers whose wages lifted families out of poverty. Today, the garment sector in Bangladesh employs over 4 million workers, mostly women, and their earnings have helped to cut poverty rates dramatically in that country. Bangladesh has grown from one of the poorest nations to a dynamic export-driven economy, all because the country chose to do what was just. It unlocked the talent of half its population, and it rewrote its economic destiny. This is social justice at work, equal opportunity for women. The poorest societies, of course, are those who fail to give women, who in some cases make up half or more of the population, the benefits of equal opportunity. Let me share a story from Lagos State in 1999, and I will issue a disclaimer immediately that I'm not making an empirical point here. It's purely anecdotal, but I will share it nevertheless. This was the first civilian administration in 1999, headed by our current president, President Tinubu, who was governor at the time, and he appointed me Attorney General. We began a landmark reform of the administration of justice system. Before I was sworn in, we had conducted a survey of 200 lawyers practicing in the Lagos High Courts. And we asked several questions. But one of the important questions for this particular example I'm giving was about the integrity, their perception of the integrity of judges. So we asked these 200 lawyers, what's your perception of the integrity of judges in the state? This was in 1999. 89% of them said that they thought judges were notoriously corrupt. We decided to act on two fronts, appointments and remuneration. We more than quadrupled take-home pay. We created new allowances. We gave each judge a home and a car to be replaced every 4 years. We also believed, and this is important, that appointing more women judges could actually reduce corruption. So of the 26 judges that were appointed at the time, 2/3 of them were women. And by the year 2000, a year after, 2001, 70% of judges in Lagos State were female. When we repeated the same survey in 2007, 0% of lawyers said judges were corrupt. Equal opportunity worked, and integrity was restored. And the point is quite simple. You don't know what you're missing until you give equal opportunities to all genders. If you don't do that, you can't know what you're missing. And I'm not making the point that women are not necessarily more honest than men. I mean, please, let's not get carried away. But anyway, I think this was clearly demonstrated in that particular example that I've just given. Rwanda, for example, their gender inclusion strategy provides further proof that equality drives growth. After 1994, Rwanda rebuilt its society with a belief that women must be equal partners in rebuilding the nation. Of course, you know that in 1994 was the genocide. Key reforms included a constitutional requirement that at least 30% of decision makers must be women, equal property and inheritance rights. And they made a major investment in girls' education and maternal health, and also support for women-owned businesses and cooperatives. Today, 60% of Rwanda's parliamentarians are women, the highest in the world. The economy responded with record growth for 2 decades. With women earning and owning assets, poverty was reduced, households regained stability, and productivity soared. Social justice expanded the productive workforce, and empowerment created new markets and, of course, new taxpayers. You cannot build a strong economy with only half your population. But inclusion is not only about gender. There's also financial inclusion, and this is crucial too. Just making it easier for rural populations to participate in the financial system can actually be a game changer. Kenya's M-Pesa, for example, is a prime example. This is a mobile money system that brought unbanked and rural populations into the financial system, widening access to finance for millions and driving major economic benefits. And research shows that M-Pesa increased per capita consumption and lifted 2% of Kenyan households out of extreme poverty, just by enabling secure transfers, savings, and more resilient incomes. Over 90% of adults in Kenya now have access to financial services. But social justice is also expressed through social investment programs, direct government interventions that empower citizens, programs like school feeding programs, cash transfers, and large microcredit schemes targeting informal traders. And all of these have shown huge economic benefits. They remove the barriers that prevent people from participating effectively in the economy. Cash transfers, for example, ensure that the poorest can become economic agents. Microcredit allows informal traders, who are the lowest in the trading value chain, to sustain their participation in commerce. Homegrown school feeding creates jobs from farm to the classroom. Farmers, aggregators, and cooks alike. When women, young people, and rural communities and informal workers are empowered as full economic agents, productivity and shared prosperity will grow. But social justice is also about climate justice. The climate crisis that we're experiencing today is a severe economic problem for Africa. Nigeria is among the top 10 most climate vulnerable countries, facing droughts, floods, sea level rise, and erosion. And by 2050, Nigeria could have 9.4 million internal climate migrants, mostly poor rural farmers displaced by floods or desertification. Yet we are not responsible for the crisis. The global north is. Climate justice is therefore a social justice issue. It centers on fairness, ensuring that those who are least responsible for the climate crisis do not suffer its worst consequences. So the global north corporations responsible for carbon-intensive activity over the decades must fund adaptation and loss and damage efforts in vulnerable countries like Nigeria. There's also the issue of environmental exploitation. Communities where resource extraction occurs, such as in the Niger Delta, and they've suffered devastating pollution and loss of livelihoods. These communities deserve a voice and must be empowered to negotiate more evenly with both the state and the resource extracting entities. Climate action must prioritize those who are most affected. Local voices, especially women, young people, indigenous groups, must be central to making decisions on climate action. Lastly, good governance is a critical social justice issue as well. And corruption, both public and private, lies at the heart of good governance. In 1994, a colleague and I, Soji Apampa, founded an anti-corruption organization called Integrity. And part of it was that we published a pamphlet titled Scrutiny to highlight why corruption is an economic injustice and how to redress corruption. Ford Foundation, by the way, provided a fund for us, or funded the organization from 1995. A report by PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates that if corruption is not addressed, it could cost our country, Nigeria, 37% of its GDP by 2030. So corruption is not just a public sector problem, it's a development problem. It actually leads to a situation where the future of our people is stolen. When public money that's meant for hospitals, for schools, for roads, and for other services is diverted into private pockets. I was a young lady named Amina, an entrepreneur who had opened her first retail store here in Abuja about 2 years ago with big dreams. She hired staff, stocked her shelves, and planned to expand. But soon, employees began to steal cash, divert stock. Of course, it was small at the beginning, but constant thefts simply began to eat into her profits. The second branch that she wanted to open was never opened. So the jobs were never created. The community never benefited. Even small-scale corruption is a barrier to growth. And research confirms that employee theft and fraud in SMEs reduce profitability and block expansion. So to produce development that reaches the majority, anti-corruption programs are not just good governance programs. They are social justice programs. They protect public resources, they strengthen businesses, and create jobs. So when we build systems of fairness and accountability in government and in the marketplace, we actually unleash inclusive economic growth, and we give our people what they deserve, a future that works for everyone. So I'll just conclude by saying that Africa's true wealth, and I'm sure we all agree, is not beneath our soil. It is in our people. When we invest in our people, when every policy and every budget and reform answers to the needs of the majority, we lay the foundation for genuine progress. So social justice is not charity. It is sound economics. It builds nations that are stable, that are peaceful and productive, because every citizen has a stake in their country's success. So once again, let me congratulate Ford Foundation on the 65th anniversary. God bless the foundation, and God bless us all. Thank you.